Hello everyone, welcome to the 1.5 degree science-based target setting in the building sector public consultation webinar. Today we've got an interesting and informative webinar for everyone. It's great to see a large number of people engaged, and first we will go to some house rules for today's webinar. So a few short housekeeping points. This is a Zoom webinar. Your camera and microphone will be muted, but we have other ways for you to participate. Please use the question and answer button in the Zoom bar at the bottom, so you can send in your questions. We have a wonderful team of experts behind the scenes, happy to answer your questions wherever possible. And any questions we don't get to, we will try to answer after this webinar. The slides will be shared after this call, so everyone who registered will receive the slides, and we will also be sharing the recording of the webinar, and this webinar will be repeated live again later today in the US and America's time zone. So, first of all, a quick agenda. Welcome everyone. We also have a quick introduction now to the team, and then we will go into the details. So today's webinar team, we have experts from the SBTi buildings team, and we also have two special guests who've been closely involved, who you'll meet later on in the presentation. So, welcome to this webinar for science-based targets setting in the building sector. And now I'm happy to get into the details of the program. Yes, what is the SBTi, Science-Based Targets Initiative? This is a global body, enabling businesses and financial institutions to set ambitious emissions reduction targets in line with the latest climate science. And now I'm going to hand over to Carl for the further introduction to SBTi.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the SBTi, to what science-based targets are, and to this project on buildings. So as Tom was saying, the SBTi is an NGO, which is a collaboration between 4 organizations: CDP, the UN Global Compact, WRI, and WWF. And what we do is we encourage companies to set ambitious targets in line with climate science. And we do this by developing resources so that companies can understand the level of ambition needed for their particular case. And we also offer independent validation of company targets. So what are science-based targets? Well, our net zero standard lays out the full framework. So the long-term net zero targets are made up of 4 elements shown on the slide. The first is the 1.5 degree aligned near-term target. So that's a target with a time frame of 5 to 10 years. The second element is the long-term target itself. That's a target to reduce emissions to a residual level by 2050 or sooner. So that's an over 90% reduction compared to today's emissions. The third element on the screen is optional. So science-based targets should be based on real emission reductions within the value chain. So that means they cannot rely on offsets or compensation. But this doesn't mean that such actions beyond the value chain don't have value. They can help reduce emissions in other parts of the economy. Therefore, companies may wish to embark on these actions as a voluntary additional action, which we call beyond value chain mitigation. And then the fourth and final part is compulsory, and that's when a company reaches its very low emissions level by its long-term target date. It must commit to reducing those residual emissions to reach net zero through permanent removals from the atmosphere. And of course, companies who don't want to set a long-term target can set only a near-term target if they wish. That's what science-based targets look like. But then the question is, how should a company calculate how much it needs to reduce its emissions for its near-term targets to be considered 1.5 degree aligned? Well, SBTi uses two main target setting methods. The first one, shown on the left-hand side of the slide, is used for the large homogeneous sectors, and that's the case with the building sector that we're discussing today. And here companies are expected to converge towards a sector decarbonization path expressed in terms of carbon intensity. So for buildings, that's kilos of CO2 per meter squared. And we refer to this method sometimes as the sectoral decarbonization approach. And I'm mentioning this now because it's the method that will be using the in-use and embodied pathways for buildings that you will hear about later. And in a moment, you'll also hear about how those carbon intensity pathways for buildings were developed. Then the other method on the right is used for all other sectors or all other emission sources, and it's called the cross-sector absolute reduction method. So it expects all companies to reduce emissions at the same linear annual rate. That was just a little introduction to SBTi and science-based targets. Now I'm going to introduce the buildings project, but before I do that, it falls to me to open one of the polls on this webinar to get to know the audience a little bit better. So this poll asks the question, where is your organization based? And I'll just ask that poll to be launched, and we leave that up for a few moments to give you a chance to answer while I go through the introduction of the buildings project. So I should say first that companies from the building sector were already able to set targets using our tools. Many have done so. We've launched this project to provide more detailed guidance to the sector and also to upgrade the ambition level to 1.5 degrees. Today is marking the launch of the public consultation. The draft guidance and tool will be published, and the consultation will run for 2 months. And the final resources are on track to be published in Q4 2023. So why did we as SBTi consider it important to offer specific guidance for this sector? Well, I think everybody in the audience knows the building sector is a huge contributor to emissions worldwide, accounting for more than 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. The sector is also growing faster, much faster than other sectors in terms of floor area. And it's also a complex sector with many different types of companies in the building sector. And that's why they need better guidance to understand how to set targets. So it's for those reasons that we launched the buildings project to offer 3 basic things. One is the 1.5 degree aligned pathways for the in-use operational emissions of buildings. The second one is the 1.5 degree pathways for the embodied emissions of buildings, which is something completely new. And the third is the target setting guidance and tool, which tell companies how to use these resources. And we haven't been working alone on this. So I want to acknowledge our partners on the project. So CREM is the Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor, and they've been offering buildings in-use pathways for a number of years. And this is the first time that SBTi and CREM are collaborating to offer one set of aligned pathways. Then we have Ramble, a consulting firm that has already done work on 1.5 degree embodied emissions pathways in Europe. So we brought them on board to develop pathways for the global sector. And then we have PwC and DSS Plus, who've been helping us develop the guidance document and the tool. So a big thank you to them. And finally, we're grateful to the Loudest Foundation for funding of this project. And then one more slide just on the organizational aspect of this project before we get into the technical details. One of the important parts of all of SBTi's projects is the creation of an expert advisory group to accompany the project. So the buildings group, you can see it on the slide. The members were carefully selected to provide a diverse balance of companies, NGOs, and academia, and they come from different geographies. So the role of these expert advisory groups is always just advisory. Final sign-off on the deliverables is by the SBTi. And that means that the documents we're presenting and publishing today do not necessarily represent the views of the whole expert advisory group. So that concludes my little introduction, and I'll hand back to our host, Tom.
Thank you, Carl. Is it possible to see the results of the poll so we know who's involved? We have almost 400 participants this morning, so that's fantastic to see. We have 40% from consulting firms, 40% from companies, and 7% from financial institutions, some industry association, NGOs and government, and academia. That's great to see. And now, moving to the part of the agenda, we're going to have a very short introduction just to the buildings, guides, and tools. So I will hand over to Ida.
Thank you, Tom. I will start with a few words about the position of science-based targets in the wide range of sustainability frameworks in the real estate and construction industries. The first and the most important difference between SBTs and asset-level frameworks is that SBTs are set for organizations and financial institutions. In this case, for entities that operate with buildings, for example, as owners, occupiers, and developers. SBTs indicate how much and by when an individual company should reduce emissions from its operations to be in line with the carbon budget. SBTs cannot, but they are not also intended to substitute any asset-level standards, certification schemes, or assessments that are an important part of design and management of buildings, enhancing the sustainability performance of individual buildings. SBTi's sector guidance documents provide guidance companies need to set their targets and include relevant tools to support in GHG accounting, target setting, and evidence needed for validation. The basis of the building sector guidance is the greenhouse gas protocol, as well as the SBTi general criteria. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, and therefore we have also used existing accounting guidance published in and for the sector. And as we have identified gaps in current GHG accounting that cause some difficulties for the companies in the industry to set science-based targets, and to help in target setting, the guidance first aims to help companies and FIs across buildings value chain by providing additional guidance on GHG accounting before explaining how their targets should be set. I think that was all my short intro.
Thank you, Isla. Now we'll be moving on to more details, and our first expert guest will be introducing the in-use emissions pathway. So I'm happy to hand over to Julia from CREM.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Julia Ryan representing CREM, and I will just give a very short overview on the collaboration and also on our new pathways, which we released in January. So just for those who might not be as aware, CREM stands for the Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor, and we provide real estate industry really transparent and science-based pathways to be in line with the 1.5 ambition, also the Paris targets. On one hand, we have operational carbon intensity and pathways, but we also have pathways for the energy intensities. Important to note here is also we really have a country and property type specific pathways, as of course this is really important, especially for the real estate industry. An asset in Germany will be different than to China, for example. And again, of course, an office building might again be different to a residential building as well. The timeline, so actually just highlighting our story so far, we launched the project back then in 2018. We actually just called ourselves a project. We were EU Horizon 2020 funded. We had the first baseline year then in 2018, but we also got follow-up funding with the Loudest Foundation. And then we also decided, okay, for the new update, where the baseline year is now 2020, we will also collaborate and align everything with SBTi. And then this kind of got everything rolling. Last year, we spent the entire year gathering the data and also launching our public consultation, very intensive phase. And we released the second set now in January of this year. And of course, all the documentation is available on our homepage. So here, as you can see, is a lot of text, but we have also a methodology document if you're more interested in this. But actually, like just to quickly highlight or summarize, we start with the global budget. Also, of course, here everything aligned with IEA, SBTi, and so on. And then we look at, okay, what is the real estate share, and then take this to the real estate sector. And then take this one step further to country level, and again, of course, then to the property type specific pathways. In the next slide, I will quickly also show what are the main points for the underlying data. So here's on the right-hand side is a table of basically what we require to get those country and property type specific pathways. So we start, of course, with world data here, of course, aligned again with IEA, IPCC report and so on. And then we go one step further to get actually country specific data. Here we're working together with a lot of different data partners and also the specific countries to make sure we have a good data set. And of course, here our main data points are the energy intensities for the different building types. We need the specific country-specific emission factors, the energy mix for the specific property type, the building stock for that country, but of course important also how does everything change and develop until 2050. So we look at how does the energy mix for that specific country and building, how might that change to 2050, and how are the emission factors developing, especially here, of course, looking at the grid decarbonization. And the same applies here for the subsectors. So not again, we only look at this at country level, but also for the specific property types. So here again, we look at the emission factors, emission factor development, and so on. So that is basically our first point that we need. We gather all of the data, and then of course we also go through very extensive internal quality control, also here aligning with the SBTi, before we then went on to this public consultation, which then ended in November. We finalized everything. Also on our homepage, you can of course see the report, which summarizes all of the changes that we did. But just to highlight a couple of points in the next slide. For those of you who already know our old pathways, we actually have some new highlights now. Of course, we improved the pathways. We have so many more data partners now, so aligning on the global level here with IPCC and IEA and so on. We really make sure that the data is really robust and quality checked. They're a lot more granular. For example, in the US, we now are covering the 15 largest cities. In Australia, we now also have 6 sub-regional pathways for the different climate zones. And we have a new property type, which is the distribution warehouse, cooled and warm. And another highlight here is also we have a new GHG pathway. So we actually have a pathway just looking at CO2, but then also one for CO2e. If you say, okay, we are tracking those F gases and fugitive emissions, then you can of course benchmark against CO2e pathway. So the small graph here just shows a snapshot of some of the countries. We have a global pathway, which all of the country level pathways converge to. And you can of course here also then see a couple of other countries, the country specific pathways, but there's also some other changes. For example, in the new pathways, we're also using the emission factors, for example, excluding transmission and distribution losses. So those are also maybe some points why you might see changes to the old pathways. But overall, we're really happy that this alignment worked now, and that we really have robust country and property type specific pathways. That's my part for the short summary, but also happy to answer any questions afterwards.
Thank you, Julia. Yes, there'll be time for questions, and everyone can put their questions in the Q&A box as we proceed. So now I'd like to hand over to our next guest speaker, who is Xavier Leden from Ramboll, who has developed the embodied emissions pathways. Xavier.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Xavier Leden. I'm a director for Ramboll Management Consulting in Belgium. Ramboll is an engineering and design consultancy firm that has a long tradition of designing sustainable buildings. I belong to the management consultancy branch of Ramboll. So what we do is basically to bring the science, the engineering science of Ramboll into good use to help policymakers, industry associations, but also private organizations in their sustainability journey. So what I will present now is basically our contribution to this new package from the SBTi. We have been working more specifically on the embodied carbon pathway, which is fairly new. What we do here is to define a reference pathway that is aligned with the SBTi fundamentals that have been presented in introduction. We focus on new construction, and we focus on upfront emissions in new construction. So basically those emissions that come from the production and the construction modules of stage of the life cycle of a building. And we derive an absolute emission pathway from which we deduct intensity targets that are measured in CO2 equivalent per meter square. So the approach is definitely top-down. So we use a multi-regional input-output model to derive from the global decarbonization pathway the pathway for buildings. So through a downscaling strategy. We combine that with a bottom-up approach to be able to derive, well, first to align with the current baseline, and second to be able to derive sub-pathways for different types of buildings. Maybe to mention as well that the reference pathway is indeed a pathway for intensity targets for upfront emissions for new construction, but we also have alternative options. We also deliver an absolute emission target and also a combined pathway for new construction and renovation. So a few more detailed elements on how we derive this pathway. We use the median of pathway for the 1.5 degree of the IPCC AR6 report with no or little overshoot. So we talk about the C1 pathway. So that's for the carbon budget. For the data on construction emission, we use the Exobase model, which is a multi-regional input-output model that provides information on the environmental impact of economic activities across regions and sectors. And for the downscaling strategy, the reference pathway uses the grandfathering, so basically the allocation principle for identifying the pathway for buildings is based on if you like, the current share of emission of the building sector in the total emissions. But we also calculate alternative pathway based on economic value added, so basically the contribution of the building sector to value added. And we also test downscaling approach based on the per capita and utilitarian principles, which basically relate to population and end user consumption perspective. Other elements are the bottom-up LCA data that we use to align the pathway to the current baseline and also derive a sub-pathway for different types of buildings. Here we use one one source, which is the study done by Martin Rock, which was interesting for us because it was providing benchmark for buildings globally. And also combining different sources is a bit tricky, considering the lack of homogeneity in the data. And finally, for building stock development, here we align with CREM. So we basically take the CREM pathway with the CREM, activity data, which relate to the IEA activity data. To disaggregate building stock development per different building types, we use a third report, which is DATEMAN. And in that way, we are able to account for building stock development globally. So here, the pathway that results from that work, it's a carbon intensity upfront embodied JJ emissions pathway for new building. So as you can see, the different pathways or sub-pathways converge towards 2050 to very close to climate neutrality. It's a fairly steep decrease of JJ emissions in the first years. To reach 97% reduction relative to 2020 absolute JJ emissions by 2050. To be aligned with a 1.5 degree target, emissions reductions are needed that go much beyond the decarbonization of the production of steel and cement. As you can imagine, reaching 97% of emission reduction, it's all hands on deck kind of a scenario. Here you can see the contribution of cement and steel, which is significant, of course, considering the share of these materials in the embodied upfront embodied carbon emissions. But as you can see also, the decrease of emissions is much slower by 2030, and it picks up after 2030. That means that further reduction measures are needed, and they are needed now, including improving design for less material use and shifting to low carbon material alternatives from reuse, recycling, or sustainable bio-based sourcing. So we really keep looking into a transformation of the way we design our buildings and on the choice of a material we make, independently of the decarbonization of the cement and steel industry. The pathways for all building construction activities, including renovation, is steeper than new construction only. So here we compare a pathway that includes both new buildings and renovation to a pathway that is focusing on new buildings only, and that is our reference pathway. So what we see here is that the pathways for all building construction activities projects a steeper reduction in kilograms CO2 equivalent per meter square, and that is due to the additional number of meter square being included for renovation, with upfront JJ emission per meter square about 50% lower for renovation than for new construction. So it's steeper because you have more meter square for a lower amount of carbon, if you like, allocated in average per meter square. However, the pathway for all building construction activities allow the market to focus on renovation and increase the number of meter square that can be provided for the same carbon budget. So the interest of this is to show that you can always arbitrate new versus renovation building to service the same or even more a number of meter square to the market. And finally, we also compare different pathways using different allocation principles, and we can see that the pathways do not significantly change when a different downscaling approach is applied. Of course, the grandfathering allocation principle is slightly more favorable in the sense that it allocates 10% of global emissions to the building sector. It is less for the other allocation principles, but still, I would say, or nevertheless, the reduction that is foreseen in the next 10 decade is steep. And that is due to the underlying projected expansion of meter square being built in the future. That is very high. I mean, it's expected to double by 2050, especially in developing economies. And that requires a steep reduction of upfront embodied emissions for new buildings in the next decade. And that basically concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Xavier. That's good information there. I think we now have a short poll, a very quick poll before we move on to the next section of the agenda. We can put up the poll. Yeah, so just for everyone to see where people are joining from today, if you can just quickly select your region. We'll wait couple of seconds for people to fill that in, and then we can see where people are joining from. While people are filling that in, next up on the agenda, we're going to have Isla is going to talk about the key criteria and considerations for the buildings pathway. Is it possible to show the result of that question before we move on? Yeah, great. So not surprisingly, considering the time zone, we have 20% people joining from Asia, a large majority from Europe, and a few people joining from Africa, and there's even some people awake in North America and Oceania. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to hand it over to Isla.
Thank you. Now that Krem and Rumble have explained how the pathways were developed, in this section, we are going to explain some of the main criteria that building sector companies will have to use when setting their targets. These are some big methodological choices that we would like greater stakeholder input on. But before we deep dive into those details, I would like to give an overview of the documents being made public today for all stakeholders to review. So we are sharing the building sector guidance for companies and financial institutions, the building sector target setting tool that incorporates both in-use and embodied emissions pathways, and also the embodied emissions pathway development description that provides information about how the embodied emissions pathways were developed. In the buildings guidance, we are proposing some mandatory scope 3 categories that must be included in the target boundary. These mandatory categories depend on the user type and are explained in detail in the guidance. Today, I share some examples from the guidance with you. First is that we are adapting the whole building approach in the guidance and that is required to follow whenever a company is involved in the use phase of a building. Building owners and occupiers are in the scope in particular. The whole building approach means that companies need to include all building related emissions into the target boundary, irrespective of the scope. For example, a building owner would need to include emissions from tenants' consumption into its target boundary. This resolves an issue created by corporate GHG accounting following scopes 1, 2, and 3, and was already adopted by PCAF and FREM in work on financed emissions. In the consultation, we ask your views on this. Is the whole building approach appropriate? Not all companies in the industry are directly involved in either the use phase of buildings or direct construction work on sites. However, they still have a significant impact on the emissions within built environment. Therefore, we have introduced additional user-specific mandatory scope 3 categories. For example, architecture companies do have significant influence over a building's emissions. Therefore, following the guidance, they would need to include lifetime emissions into their target in category 11, use of sold products. Another example is developers who will need to include embodied emissions in category 2, capital goods, into their target boundary. In the consultation, we ask your views on these categories. We have also introduced several special considerations to address challenges identified in the industry. Some examples of addressed issues are reporting requirements and special conditions for building portfolios with high turnover, grace periods to allow decarbonization measures to be implemented when a low-performing asset is acquired, a reporting metric to mitigate the risk of misinterpreting divestments as emissions reductions, and 3 complementary criteria or commitment to ensure sufficient reductions. In the public consultation survey, we ask for your thoughts on these special considerations. Do you agree with them? And if you don't, Why or what alternatives would you propose? In the following slides, I will shortly explain some of these. Companies and financial institutions whose business model is reliant on high turnover of assets are allowed to set fixed intensity targets aligned to sectoral decarbonization pathways. A fixed intensity target means that a company shall ensure that its portfolio emissions intensity is at or below the ambition level set by the pathway for each individual year within the target period. To qualify for this target setting method, the user must demonstrate that high portfolio turnover is integral to their business model, and there are examples of this provided in the guidance. As touched already previously, buildings are not only constructed and occupied, but they are also traded. And if a low-performing building is divested, it might look like decarbonization measure in a company's accounting, even though in reality, the emissions of the building are just being transferred outside the boundary of the inventory. This is called carbon leakage. And to improve transparency behind emissions reductions and to ensure an understanding of the real-world impact of investors' actions, we are proposing users to provide disclosure regarding emission reductions from decarbonization of assets, for example, by using the like-for-like approach, and emissions reductions achieved through divestments of assets. And then in addition to traditional science-based target setting, we propose requiring or recommending complementary commitments to ensure and back up that the carbon budget is being conserved. Proposed measures in the guidance are A, recommending companies to commit to energy efficiency improvements that are in line with CRREM's energy reduction pathways. This is to encourage companies to conduct energy efficiency measures, which are necessary in reaching the net zero economy by 2050, considering the significant increase in the floor areas globally. Another commitments, B is requiring a commitment to no new fossil fuel installations in buildings portfolios from 2025. This means that when the current fossil fuel installation reaches the end of their lifetime, they would not be renewed, but instead substituted with technologies that do not demand fossil fuels. And in the consultation, we are really interested in hearing your views on these additional commitments. In the preceding slides, we have given you a flavor of the 1.5-degree pathways, GHG accounting guidance, and user-specific rules to be taken into account by users. I will finish by showing what this looks like for 2 example companies. In the guidance, we have many more examples. The first example here shows in-use emissions targets. The case company A is a REIT that has 6 shopping malls across the USA. It owns and manages 2 malls in New York, 2 in Houston, and 2 in Chicago, and additionally leases an office space. Using the target setting tool, the aggregated reduction target for whole building and operational emissions is 58%. And the target wording for the rate would be as seen on the screen. Well, next, and now we have already moved to the other example, which is on embodied emissions. With embodied emissions, the geographical location does not matter as the pathways are global. And for embodied emissions, we are also proposing 2 different target setting methods. And in this slide, you will see both options for these 2 examples. The example company, company B, is a developer that develops sports and leisure facilities. Absolute contraction target for the company would be 31% from the base year 2021 to target year 2030. if the company chooses to use sector-specific intensity target, the reduction rate would be 53.8% from 21 to 2030. So we are proposing these two different methods. An absolute contraction target means that the reductions are measured in absolute terms, whereas the SDA-based intensity target is per developed square meter.
Thank you, Ayla. Now, before we move on to the Q&A session, we have another poll for you to fill in. While that's being brought up, our team of experts are hard at work answering all the questions in the Q&A box. But first of all, if you could fill in the poll here, this is related to those of you from a company. If your company has validated science-based targets, a commitment to set a science-based target, considering setting a target, or is currently not interested or not applicable. And while you're filling that in quickly, we have 4 questions already set for our panelists. We aim to finish before the end of that hour. So we'll definitely get through those 4, and then we can see if we have time for any additional questions before we conclude. So if it's possible to put up the results of the poll before we move to the next question, thank you. So fantastic to see that we've got 26% of attendees, companies already have a validated science-based target, another 16% with a commitment, and 31% interested. So a good majority there. That's fantastic to see. So now, after all that details, we're now going to move into a couple of questions. And the first question is for Javier, and that is, why are pathways for upfront embodied emissions only? Why don't they include embodied emissions from renovations?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. I mean, indeed, renovation matter a lot in the decarbonization of the building sector. Because they save, of course, emissions to existing buildings, and we know that to reach the same standard of energy consumption, I mean, it takes 50% less of embodied carbon to renovate deeply a building than to build a new. That said, it's simply not very convenient to build a pathway that combines renovation and new construction. The underlying logics are fairly different, but most importantly, we don't really have the necessary data to develop a pathway that would be meaningful to inform renovation, and that is simply because renovation projects are extremely different from one to the other, and would basically give the wrong signal if providing a pathway that combines both. So instead, the recommendation is that, of course, for new buildings, you use the SBTi pathway for upfront emissions for new buildings, and for renovation, they're still included in your Scope 3 emissions. Hopefully, these embodied emissions will come with reduction of in-use emissions. So that's the good news, but you will still report them under Scope 3 emissions and apply the standard absolute decarbonization target that you would apply to your company overall.
Thank you, Xavier. The next question is for Ayla. What is a net zero building according to SBTi?
Thank you for the question. We don't define a net zero building. We define a net zero state for the economy, and all targets are forward-looking, aiming to reach that state. We don't define what is good performance today, nor do we validate at asset level. So we are not assessing individual buildings. As said previously, SBTs are to indicate how much and by when an individual company should reduce emissions from its operations to be in line with the carbon budget.
Thank you, Ayla. And the next question is for Julia. Why are the newly released CREM pathways lower than the previous release?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and of course a question which we get quite often, because you can actually notice sometimes quite a big difference to the old pathways, but there's some explanations. For example, one is we have a different methodology in some aspects. For example, we're now excluding transmission and distribution losses. So now we're using that lower emission factor to convert from an energy intensity to a CO2 point, and that of course already makes that starting point lower. But please note here, of course, this will not have an effect on your starting point, because now of course when you're benchmarking your specific asset or your portfolio, you will also use that emission factor, and then again be in line with the CREM benchmark. But of course we also have other underlying data which makes the pathway a bit more strict and harder to achieve. Of course, we've noticed that there's some changes also in the energy intensities and the starting point. And if we actually realized, okay, the sector has improved, maybe not as fast as we expected it, but in some points we're actually more energy efficient. And then here we have a lower starting point. And again, when we convert this over to the CO2, this will result a lower starting point. And a final point as well is also grid decarbonization. We also seen that since 2018 till now, actually, we already noticed some grid decarbonization, and that will again also make the weighted emission factor lower. So then, which will also result in those lower starting points. And also the development, of course, of the pathway. You notice more of a dip now and not more of a straight line, but we have this dip, especially between 2030 and 40. And this is also because faster grid decarbonization on country level is assumed. And also on the global level, there's also the complete grid decarbonization until 2040.
Thank you, Julia. The next one is for Carl. The lowest carbon building is one that was never built. How does the SBTi incentivize sufficiency, that is, reducing demand for floor area per capita or doing more with less?
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is a great question, and one that we've given a lot of thought to, and we've even asked ourselves whether science-based targets is the appropriate place to consider this. But I've seen some points being made around this in the chat. It may seem that because we have carbon intensity pathways, so kilos of CO2 per meter squared, you're just expected to reduce the carbon intensity and not necessarily the absolute emissions associated. Well, in fact, you are. All of SBTi's methods, even the intensity methods, have the absolute emissions as part of the calculation. So you're expected to decrease those. So that naturally pushes companies to do things like renovations, using less material, using less floor area per capita. However, the building sector is a little bit different to other sectors, which is that there is going to be this large growth in floor area, mostly driven by floor area and rising living standards in the global south. So we wouldn't want to inadvertently somehow restrict those rising living standards. So therefore, we've tried to find a balance between these two aspects, and we're very interested in your comments. I do think that the way the upfront embodied pathways are steeper than any pathway you might be using for your renovation embodied emissions does push you naturally towards renovations, extending the life of buildings and building less floor area.
Thank you, Carl. We have another question here for Isla. Why do you not use the whole life cycle carbon approach? What do you mean by the whole building approach?
That is indeed a good question, and something we get quite often. We have discussed this a lot. I will start with definitions because these concepts can be indeed quite confusing. So whole life carbon assessments are conducted for an individual building to optimize its design and performance over the building's lifetime, which is separate from the whole building approach, where accounting for operational emissions from the reporting period is done despite the ownership of those emissions, meaning that it doesn't matter into which scope those emissions fall into. There are a few reasons for not using the whole life carbon approach in setting SBTs. One is that SBTs are based on the GHG protocol and on organizational emissions. As said already, we don't go to the asset level, which is in the core of whole life carbon. And as the reporting towards SBTs is done usually on an annual basis, which can be also challenging from a whole life carbon perspective, where the whole lifetime is being considered. However, whole life carbon assessments are an important part of managing the built environment towards net zero future. And these two concepts do complement each other, I would say, in a very good way.
Thank you, Ayla. Next one is for Carl. How does the guidance affect material producers, e.g. cement or steel producers?
Yeah, so the new guidance for buildings in principle doesn't affect the obligations of producers of those materials, cement, steel, or others. Those companies should use our sector-specific methods for those materials. So we have a cement method, we will soon have a steel method, or you can use our cross-sector methods. So your obligations don't change if you're one of those producers. Of course, the pathways that we developed for those sectors have influenced the pathways that were developed by Ramboll, as explained by Xavier, for the embodied emissions of buildings. So the pathways are a little bit less steep, in fact, because of the fact that in the next 10 years or so, it will still be a challenge to make steep emission reductions for cement and steel. And then the other way it comes in is that, of course, if you are a constructor and you're purchasing cement and steel, you can, if you wish, use the cement or steel pathways to set your Scope 3 targets. Or you can use the generic methods, or you can use the embodied emission pathway as an overall embodied emission target.
Thank you, Carl. The next question is for Ayla. How do you deal with the risk that if companies must only comply with a carbon target, they may not be incentivized to reduce the energy demand of buildings and just supply inefficient buildings with renewable energy?
Thank you. For this particular reason, we have introduced a criteria which mandates the use of location-based method to report Scope 3 emissions. There is also another justification for this criteria, which is related to the whole building approach and some reporting practices, but it's also related to energy efficiency. Additionally, one of the complementary commitments is on energy efficiency to answer to this challenge.
Thank you, Ayla. We've got a lot of questions in the Q&A and maybe time for two more to answer live. What is the difference between building level certifications such as LEED and BREEAM and SBTi's framework for Carl?
Yeah, so as I already mentioned in her presentation, the SBTi's framework is really at portfolio level, so the level of the whole company's average emission or the level of the whole financial institution, and it's based on the greenhouse gas protocol, whereas building level certification schemes like LEED and BREEAM are really at the asset level, and they're really looking at today's performance. So they're two different approaches, but they can and should be complementary. So the asset level certification will help you in improving your buildings in order to meet the targets that you're setting at the level of the whole company. And the other thing I should say is that we do want to align as far as we can to those schemes to help companies so that the work they do at asset level will be helpful for the SBTs. And we are in contact with the Green Building Councils at global level and in various countries to make sure that we can further align on that.
Thank you, Carl. Last question, also for Carl. How should financial institutions use this guidance?
Yeah, so it's important to know that the SBTi does have specific guidance for financial institutions, and that guidance is mostly focusing on how they should cover their Scope 3 Category 15 investments, and it also points to the fact that they can use our sector-specific methods as relevant. So it already talks about real estate as a sector. So what this buildings guidance does is it just kind of adds more detail to that. It does add some more obligations for FIs, which include things like if they're involved in the development of new buildings, they would have to look at the embodied emissions of those buildings, not just the in-use emissions. And after a grace period, they would have to increase the ambition to 1.5 degrees aligned with the new pathways. Right now, they can still have just well below 2-degree in-use emission pathways targets for their financed emissions.
Thank you, Carl. As always, we're getting a lot of questions in the Q&A chat box, and we have our team working hard to answer as many questions of those currently live, and we don't have time to do all the questions live or questions that everyone would like answered, but we will do our best there. Before we wrap up, we have one more poll for you to answer, which will help us look what you are most interested in. So particularly for the team to take away, it would be great to know which area you're most interested in, understanding how science-based target setting works for the building sector, learn what the target setting process entails, learn how science-based targets will encourage the industry to decarbonize. So maybe we can leave that up for a short period. In the meantime, to wrap up today, first, please respond to the survey that is currently out. We have the deadline for providing your feedback to the SBTi buildings guidance until the 16th of July this year. All the materials for the public consultation can be found, and background can be found on the SBTi buildings webpage. And of course, we will be circulating the slides and the recording of this webinar. If it's possible to put up the results of the final poll, that would be great to see. Yes, thank you. So not surprisingly, most people here are aiming to get an understanding of the draft guidance, understand how it works, and a lower percentage for what the target setting process entails, and learning how science-based targets will encourage individuals to set targets. So we can close that poll and move to our last slide for today. First of all, a big thank you to everyone for attending. A massive thank you to our panelists and experts and everyone behind the scenes who's contributed to the development of the building guidance. This is not the last chance to find out more information. Please go to the website. Please participate in the public consultation. For more information, you can contact the email addresses shown here and all the links. And with that, I would like to say thank you everyone for attending and participating in today. And therefore we will close today's webinar. Thank you.